India's Minister of State for Atomic Energy, Jitendra Singh, recently announced that the country has signed bilateral agreements with a range of countries, but mostly from Africa. Now, these include Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Malawi, and the Ivory Coast, all rich in critical and rare earth minerals are a group of minerals found deep in the Earth's crust. They are difficult to find and extract. They are considered critical resources as they are vital for electric vehicles, smartphones, and electronics.
Something big just happened in Africa, and Washington is furious. For months, the US has watched quietly as India moved across the African continent, signing mysterious agreements, sending teams of geologists, and shaking hands with presidents from Zambia to Mozambique. But last week, it became official. India has secured a 12 billion rare earth and critical mineral deal with 5 African nations, a deal that could completely rewrite the global balance of power in the 21st century. And behind closed doors, Washington is panicking, because this isn't just about minerals. It's about control over the materials that power fighter jets, smartphones, missiles, and electric cars. For decades, the United States dominated that control through its allies and corporations. But now Africa is choosing differently. And for the first time, India, not America, not Europe, not China, is leading the charge. Let's talk about what really happened. A few months ago, India quietly dispatched a team of geologists to Zambia, one of Africa's richest copper and cobalt regions. Reuters, July 2025. Officially, it was an exploratory mission. Unofficially, it was India's opening move in a resource war that could decide who dominates the green tech economy. Not long after, similar partnerships emerged in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Cote d'Ivoire, where Indian state-backed companies signed memoranda of understanding to explore and process rare earth elements. Business Insider Africa and Club of Mozambique 2025. Altogether, the investment commitments crossed $12 billion, a figure that instantly caught Washington's attention. Because these aren't ordinary minerals. They ray the secret ingredients behind America's most advanced technologies, the magnets that make F-35 fighter jets fly, the batteries that power Teslas, the sensors that guide missiles. Without rare earths, modern power collapses. And now India and Africa are saying these resources will no longer be controlled from Washington or Beijing. They'll be managed from Lusaka, Maputo, and New Delhi. See, for decades, China held the monopoly. Over 90% of global rare earth refining happens in Chinese facilities. North Africa Post, 2025. Whenever Beijing sneezes, the rest of the world catches a shortage. So the US and its allies have been desperate to find new suppliers. Washington thought India would help it counter China. But instead, India looked south to Africa, building its own independent network of supply chains. And that's what's driving the fury in Washington. Sources inside the US State Department have called India's African resource outreach a strategic blind spot. Because while American officials were busy hosting democracy summits and military drills, India was signing mining rights and building processing hubs. Real power comes from what goes underground and who owns it. India isn't doing this alone. It recently launched the National Critical Mineral Mission (NCM), a nation-wide plan to secure essential minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths from partner nations. Zimbabwe Star and Upstox Business News, 2025. The mission's goal? Make India self-reliant, break foreign monopolies, and turn the global south into the center of tomorrow's energy economy. For Africa, this is a revolution. For the United States, it's a nightmare. Because if African nations align with India, not America, the global resource map changes overnight. Think about it. Africa owns more than 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves. India has the technology, manpower, and industrial hunger to process them. Together, they can build a new supply chain, one free from Western sanctions, Western conditions, and Western interference. And Washington can't stop it. But here's the part they don't want you to know. This deal isn't just economic, it's political. Each of the African governments involved insisted on local value addition, meaning minerals 1T just be dug up and shipped away. They'll be refined, processed, and manufactured on African soil. That means jobs, industries, and sovereign control, something US corporations rarely allowed. So when US diplomats called these deals opaque and non-transparent, what they really meant was, we're losing influence. Behind the scenes, American think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies (CSIS) and the Council on Foreign Relations (CFR) have been warning the White House that India's rise in Africa could complicate Western mineral strategies. Translation: Washington no longer gets to dictate the price or the politics of Africa's minerals. And that's why, as soon as news of the $12 billion partnership leaked, Western outlets started running stories questioning India's methods and motives. It's the same old playbook. When the West loses control, they call it corruption. When others win, they call it manipulation. But this time, Africa isn't apologizing. Because for once, the deals aren't written in Washington or Paris, they're written in Lusaka, New Delhi, and Harare. This is Africa's moment to turn the raw riches of its soil into power, independence, and dignity, and the symbolism runs deep. During colonial times, India and Africa shared the same struggle, exploited for resources, divided by empire, ignored by power. Now, both are uniting to reclaim what was taken. So when you hear American analysts say India is drifting away from Western alignment, what they really mean is, India and Africa are building a future that doesn't need us. And that's why Washington is furious, because this isn't just about a $12 billion deal, it's about a world that's finally starting to move without America's permission. Let's break down why this $12 billion deal is shaking Washington to its core.
For decades, Africa was treated as a resource supermarket for the West. US and European corporations extracted gold, oil, and cobalt, exported the raw materials, and left empty promises behind. The pattern was simple: Africa digs, the West profits. But something began to shift after 2020. When global supply chains collapsed during the pandemic, the United States suddenly realized just how dependent it had become on other nations, especially China, for the critical minerals that power its entire economy. A report by the Council on Foreign Relations warned that 80% of U.S. rare earth imports come in directly from China. So Washington began looking for partners it could trust. Africa, with its mineral wealth, seemed the perfect candidate. There was only one problem. India was already there. While American policymakers held endless strategic dialogues, New Delhi moved boots and brains onto the ground. In Zambia, Indian geologists began surveying over 9,000 square kilometers of copper and cobalt-rich land, critical materials for EV batteries. Reuters 2025. In Zimbabwe and Malawi, Indian firms signed MOUs for exploration of rare earth elements, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium minerals used in magnets. For wind turbines and missiles, Club of Mozambique 2025. In Mozambique, joint ventures were launched to develop local processing plants, not just raw extraction. The plan was clear: build an Africa-India value chain, bypassing Western middlemen entirely. Washington didn't believe it at first. But when photos surfaced of Indian engineers touring African processing sites wearing joint flag badges, the tricolor of India next to the green, gold, red of Africa, US analysts finally sounded the alarm. The North Africa Post wrote that India's outreach threatens to redraw the global rare earth map. That was diplomatic. Language for America is losing control. Now, some might ask, why $12 billion? That figure represents a combination of public sector investments, state loans, and private Indian conglomerate deals under the umbrella of the National Critical Mineral Mission NCM. Zimbabwe Star 2025. The NCM's goal is straightforward: secure global mineral rights, build domestic refining capacity, ensure India becomes a hub for green manufacturing by 2030. For Africa, it's a win-win. Instead of exporting raw or for pennies, African nations get processing plants, roads, railways, and thousands of local jobs. That is the exact opposite of how U.S. corporations historically operated: extract, export, and abandon. So when India and Africa shook hands on this $12 billion blueprint, Washington knew the old model had been broken. Here's the truth Washington won't say out loud: the United States doesn't fear losing money, it fears losing leverage. Rare earths aren't just about phones and batteries. They are the new oil, the lifeblood of 21st century dominance. Whoever controls the supply controls the future. A Pentagon study once revealed that over 800 U.S. military systems depend on rare earth components. From laser-guided bombs to radar systems, even the F-35 fighter jet all require these minerals. Now imagine if those minerals came from Africa-India partnerships beyond Washington's influence. For U.S. strategists, that's a national security nightmare. That is why think tanks like the Center for Strategic and International Studies (CSIS) began releasing urgent memos calling for greater U.S. presence in African mineral corridors. Translation: they want to reclaim control before it's too late, but Africa isn't sleeping anymore. From Lusaka to Harare, leaders are rejecting one-sided deals. They're demanding value addition, technology transfer, and ownership. Take Zimbabwe, for example. When Western nations imposed sanctions, India stepped in with equipment and expertise for rare earth exploration. When the US asked for exclusive mining rights, African ministers replied, "This time our minerals will feed African industries first." For decades, Africa supplied the raw material for Western wealth. Today, those same materials will fuel African development with India as a cooperative partner, not a master. While the world sees trade agreements, behind the curtain it's a chess game of strategic influence. The US has been pushing for its Minerals Security Partnership (MSP), a coalition of Western allies to secure non-Chinese, non-Russian mineral supply, but India hasn't joined it. Instead, it's quietly building an alternative, a South-South mineral corridor linking Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Think about the symbolism. For over a century, minerals left Africa heading north to Europe, to America. Now they move east to India. The flow of power is reversing, and Washington can't stand watching. The compass spin. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. The US assumed India's expansion in Africa would automatically weaken China's hold, but the reality? India isn't fighting China for America, it's competing for itself. Both Asian giants are carving their own lanes, and Africa is smartly playing them off each other to maximize benefit. When China imposed export restrictions on rare earths in 2024, India accelerated its African outreach. The Star Malaysia 2025. For New Delhi, this was about resilience. For Washington, it looked like betrayal. Because if India and China both establish independent rare earth supply chains through Africa, America becomes the outsider in a game it once dominated. Inside the US Capitol, committees have already started whispering about monitoring Indian activities in Africa. Some lawmakers propose conditioning aid to African nations that engage in non-transparent mineral deals. Sound familiar? It's the same pressure the US used during the Cold War, only this time it's not working. African governments have new friends, new funding sources, and most importantly, new confidence. When Washington warns about debt traps, leaders reply, "You had 60 years to build our industries, now let others try." And when Western media calls India's involvement opaque, African citizens see the truth. Roads are being built, refineries are opening, and jobs are appearing. That's transparency you can see with your own eyes. For India, this $12 billion move isn't charity, it's strategy. India's domestic demand for rare earths is exploding. It already holds 8% of global reserves but refines less than 2%. Economic Times Manufacturing 2025. Africa fills that gap perfectly. But beyond economics, there's geopolitics. India knows that by helping Africa industrialize, it gains allies across the continent, vital votes in the United Nations, support in BRICS, and partnerships in global trade corridors. Every African leader who signs a mineral deal with India is also signing into a new vision of multipolar power, a world not ruled from one capital, but built by many. This deal could mark the beginning of a continental awakening. For too long, Africa has been rich in resources but poor in influence. The India-Africa partnership challenges that curse. Imagine processing plants in Harare, Lusaka, and Lilong, employing local youth, exporting finished magnets and batteries, not just raw ore. Imagine a generation of African engineers trained by Indian experts, mastering technologies once locked behind Western patents. That's what frightens Washington most, an empowered Africa that no longer begs for aid. Now notice the headlines. Western media suddenly warns that India's Africa outreach could spark instability. When China did it, they called it debt trap diplomacy. When India does it, they call it opaque investment. But when Western companies strip a continent bare, they call it foreign direct investment. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, and African audiences are no longer buying it. Platforms like Talk of Africa 360 exist precisely because people are tired of one-sided stories. They want the full picture, raw, unapologetic, and real. Here's what economists are predicting. By 2030, Africa-India mineral cooperation could account for 15% of global rare earth trade. That's billions in new revenue for African nations and billions lost for Western suppliers. It could also reshape alliances. More African states joining BRICS Plus, demanding reform. At the IMF and World Bank, every dollar that circulates between Africa and India is a dollar leaving the old colonial circuit, and every deal signed without Western approval is another crack in the system of control that kept the continent dependent for centuries. This $12 billion deal sends a message louder than any speech. Africa is open for partnership, not for plunder. It's telling the world, if you want our minerals, you invest in our people. India listened, the US didn't, and that's why one side is gaining influence while the other is losing relevance. There's also something deeper, a sense of shared struggle. Both India and Africa know what it feels like to be exploited, dismissed, underestimated. Both carry the scars of colonization. Now, they're transforming that pain into partnership. When Prime Minister Modi visited African leaders in 2024, he said, "Our friendship is built on equality, not extraction." It resonated, because that's exactly what Africans have been waiting to hear for generations. So, what can America do now? If it attacks India too harshly, it risks losing one of its Indo-Pacific allies. If it ignores Africa, it concedes the future. Either way, it's a lose-lose. That's why US officials are scrambling to launch new partnership summits, promising billions in green energy funding. But Africans have heard those promises before, and this time they're watching the results on the ground. This deal isn't just about minerals, it's about a shift in global consciousness, from Ghana to Kenya. From Nigeria to Tanzania, young Africans are saying, "We want cooperation, not domination." India's rise in Africa represents the broader rise of the global South nations writing their own rules, trading on their own terms. And the United States, once the architect of the world order, is being forced to adapt or fade into irrelevance. Remember the image, African and Indian flags, fluttering side by side above a new processing plant. That image terrifies Washington more than any missile or speech ever could, because it represents something unstoppable, a unity of purpose. The old system relied on division, divide Africa by language, by border, by ideology. Now, nations are uniting around shared interest, and with each handshake, the shadow of empire grows fainter. To the millions watching across the continent, this story isn't just about India or America, it's about you. Every new mine that refines locally, every young African trained as an engineer, every factory built on African soil that's power returning home. This is not charity, this is justice long delayed, finally delivered. By 2025's end, analysts in Washington are predicting that Africa will supply 25% of India's rare earth imports. That means billions in trade flowing south-south, bypassing the dollar system entirely. For the first time, America can't set the terms. That's why they're furious. Not because India or Africa did anything wrong, but because they did something different. They chose partnership over permission. So let's be clear, this isn't the end of American influence. It's the beginning of a new era, one where the world no longer revolves around one superpower. Africa and India have drawn a new map, not on paper, but in purpose. A map where cooperation replaces coercion. Where minerals don't leave the continent in silence, but return as industries, jobs, and pride. Washington can rage, analysts can write, and pundits can panic, but history has already turned the page. Because the future is being written right now in the minds of Zambia, the labs of New Delhi, and the hearts of a billion Africans, who finally understand their worth. Africa is not a playground anymore, it's the new power ground. And that's why the United States is furious, because a $12 billion handshake just redrew the world. You're a Frikva Benwies where truth has no filter, and Africa's voice is louder than ever. Like, share, and stay tuned. Because the world is changing, and it's changing right here.